Hi, Dr. Vora. Thank you so much for being on the Sakara Life podcast with us again. We're so happy to have you back.
Hi, Danielle. Thanks for having me.
So we like to start off every podcast with a question about your mission here on Earth. So what are you here to do, to be in service of?
Gosh, I feel often that at least a part of my mission is changing the conversation around mental health. And I want to make sure that we are shifting the narrative toward a way that people can feel less despair, where they don't feel so stuck, and where they can feel empowered and hopeful.
What is considered good mental health these days?
Well, what I consider to be good mental health is that your so-called mental health should recede into the background. We should just have a baseline of energy, positive outlook, a feeling of capacity, and an ability to tolerate discomfort that serves as a foundation. So we go off and live our lives. It certainly does not mean we are happy all the time. I think that I really love a Chinese medicine analogy of a bamboo tree, that it's so flexible and it sways in the breeze and it sways towards happiness, but it also sways toward anger, towards sadness. It sways into grief, it can sway into ecstasy, and that it comes back to its center. So I think good mental health is being that flexible bamboo tree that we can fully feel whatever arises in us, but we're not getting stuck or entrenched in any one place. And feeling like we are drowning in any particular stuck emotion is not a barrier to our ability to carry out our version of a fulfilling life.
Have you heard, I don't know who to give credit to, but there is this school of thought that kind of when traumatic things happen to us, we sort of emotionally freeze at that age and then carry that age of emotionality with us. So like something happened. So like my parents divorced when I was 5. So that to me was, a big event in my life. And part of me is still frozen as that 5-year-old. And so as that kind of equals mental health, I love what you're saying. You're tying those two things together, where mental health is really like learning resilience, working through maybe where we're stuck, so that your mental health isn't in the driver's seat. It's just kind of driving and you don't even know. Have you heard of that school of thought? And I guess the question comes from wondering, is mental health something that we build and grow? Is it something we're just kind of given biochemically at birth from our genetic code? Is it something we learn from our family? Like, where do you think it comes from?
So much in that. And I think that there is truth to that concept, but I only ascribe to it to the extent that it's helpful, and not if it has somebody feeling like they're screwed
or they're stuck. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that if it is true, it will only ever be a piece of us, not our totality. Mm-hmm. But I think that I always think about trauma as if you don't have the right container to process and metabolize what you went through, if you feel alone in your suffering, alone in the trauma, if you're not able to talk it through and arrive at some degree of resolution and basically tell your nervous system that threat has passed and now you are safe. If you lack that container, I think there is a way that this experience that was more than you could metabolize in that moment, whether it was that you were too young or you just didn't have the right support, it's almost like we shove a bunch of clutter into a closet and then push that door and lock it. And it's effectively like we have this overstuffed closet somewhere in the brain. And that has implications. I think it can prevent us from having this smooth flow of energy through the brain. I think that it can mean that there's a little bit of a hot lava, do not touch area of our unconscious that we skirt around, and that can show up in how someone might be really rigid. They might be unwilling to engage in really deeply emotional material. And so I think that's sort of how I make sense of it. That's what I think gets stuck. But that you're never fully stuck. We can always, in a supportive setting, open that closet and start taking out the pieces and say, okay, like, here's what's in there. It feels like the boogeyman, but we can take these pieces out and work through it and bring it to some state of resolution. I think mental health, like, what is it? Is it genetic and biochemical? Is it modeled or learned? It's a combination of all of these things. We have a genetic predisposition, which shows up a little bit as our temperament. Some of us are agreeable, some of us are disagreeable, which sounds worse than it is. Disagreeable in many ways just means you're more inclined to think differently and less inclined to just go with the groupthink. Some of us are neurotic, and sometimes we're conscientious, and sometimes we're extroverted or introverted. We have all of these different ways of being. But I think some of our genetic predisposition, it has to do with, are we more likely to end up depressed if we go through a difficult thing? We're even different genetically in that respect. Some of us can go through something difficult in childhood and it doesn't change the trajectory of our mental health. Some of us, we do have a gene that's making us more likely to have a mental health impact of a traumatic event. But then again, if there is no traumatic event, that won't even manifest in that person. But for me, the focus on genes is overwrought. And I always find our genetic understanding of mental health, the one that tells us our mental health issues are a genetic chemical imbalance, I think that's often our least hopeful narrative about mental health. And it's a piece of it, but it's only ever a predisposition, never a destiny. We're never stuck with what our genes are in the ways that it's nudging us. And part of that is because we know that with the field of epigenetics, that actually our genes are in a dynamic relationship with our environment. And we can influence what genes are expressed and what genes are silenced. But there's also the fact that our mental health is influenced by all these modifiable environmental factors, whether that's our physical health, our psychospiritual health, whether we have our needs for community, whether they go unmet or we start to find ways to meet those needs. And certainly what was modeled for us by our caregivers has an influence on our mental health. But all of this is what we can change. Even if you didn't get a great model in your childhood, there's ways that we can reparent ourselves. We can be reparented by a therapist. We can learn new ways of self-efficacy, resilience, and capacity. So I prefer to focus on the things that we have some control over. And that's where we have reason for empowerment and for hope.
Before I had kids, I sort of naively just figured it was like mostly nurture and not a lot of nature. And I had my first kid and I was like, oh yeah, she's like so calm and easy. It's totally nurture. I'm like such a great parent. And then I had my second who just like so deeply humbled me. And then now I'm pretty convinced they come in like 99% downloaded, and that my job is just to help them build the skills and feel safe enough to try things on and, take things off and have like a safe arena in which they get to experiment with who they are. But I hear what you're saying on the genetic part, but then I personally think that like wherever our souls go, like in our family, we always talk about coming from the stars. And it's like they really come in with so much. I mean, my son came in with a furrow on his brow and just like such a deep feeler. But to your point, and what I hear you saying is that could define him. But actually what I've seen is that it has given him skills. Like this kid will come up to the table and take responsibility for his actions because he's had to, because he has big feelings and he wants to maintain that safe space and that safe container. And so one of the rules in our family is like, you can have big feelings, but if something goes wrong, come back and take responsibility and ownership. And so he's really good at it. And then my daughter, who like rarely has, anything that is bubbling over as far as we can tell on the outside, it's really hard to get her to take responsibility when something goes wrong. And so you just watch, to your point, where it's like, yeah, that could have been his defining narrative. But actually we have so much control. And what it's given him is this skill set that I think is actually going to make life quite easy for him in that way, where he's going to be able in relationship to say, hey, that was my bad. And I'm really sorry that I did that. Maybe we'll see. I don't know. My daughter, it might be hard, continue to be hard for her. So yeah, I hear what you're saying where, yeah, we might have predispositions, but maybe those are more about the lessons they bring us. They're not like our defining narrative of who we become, both emotionally, mentally, psycho-spiritually, as you said.
It's interesting because certain qualities in a kid there's certainly a whole menu of what we'd say, these are good traits, these are bad traits. But often what it lines up with is just, these make me as a parent, they make my life easier or harder.
Right.
And,
so true.
And I often have to look at my daughter and recognize, I don't actually know what role she has contracted in for, but I suspect that a lot of her challenges, a lot of her traits that make my life harder are a big part of what she needs to carry out her mission. And I think that I have a role in arriving at a stance of radical acceptance to it, to recognize like, this is hard for me, but is it fundamentally wrong or bad? Does this make her a bad person? Certainly not. And I think what's been interesting in my own journey with that is a lot of her shadow qualities hold up a mirror to mine. And so sometimes that's confronting and triggering, but more so lately, what that's been for me is in forcing myself to find a stance of radical acceptance and compassion for those traits in her, even those traits that kind of are uncomfortable for me to look at, because there are a lot of the traits that have been hard for me and my own mission. It actually also then logically holds right in front of me, like, well, can I also offer myself radical acceptance and compassion for that? Can I send that back up to my dad, where I think I see traces of him in me and then in my daughter? And so I think what we see in these kids is it's far beyond what we ever get to comprehend, is what they've contracted in for. But they have these qualities, and just because something makes our life harder, I think it's a beautiful it's the role of being the custodian of not shaming them out of that. It's profound work.
Right. And to your point earlier, it's also welcoming those lessons, and like that is, to your point, a sign of mental health, where it's like you can welcome the hardships because you know they will bring learnings and an opportunity for growth. And so how, if somebody, children or not children, I mean, I'm sure all the caregivers out there understand the stress that it comes along with having children, but there's certainly so many other reasons people are stressed out. And if somebody has the tendency to look at a stressful moment as something that brings them down, and maybe for the short term, it's no big deal, but like brings them down for the long term and really affects their mental health. What do you usually tell people, and what do you see are the biggest differences between, those types of behaviors versus the people that can look at a stressful situation and say, I've got this, or I'm going to get through it?
I mean, a lot of us have that really modeled for us, that externalization of blame and the very victim mentality of like, woe is me, it's so unfair, I always get the short end of the stick. And that was modeled for us, and we take that on. And funnily enough, I think we express what was modeled for us all the more when we're under stress. It's really when we're clear and calm, that's when we can choose how to respond to a situation. But when we're under stress, we're reacting, we're shooting from the hip. And then what comes out is what was modeled for us in childhood. But we always have this opportunity to say, hey, maybe I don't want to carry that script forward. And I remember I was just the early days of friends of mine having kids, and I heard one of my friends say to her daughter, who was maybe 2 or 3 at the time, and she was melting down, and my friend said, regroup, like, we got this. And I remember hearing that and thinking, that's a really useful framing. Like, I could have really used a little cheering on from the caregiver of like, you got this, let's regroup, let's reset, Control, Alt, Delete. And we can do that for ourselves. So I have 2 things to say about it too, 2 additional things. So one is that there's a movement of toxic positivity where we might say everything happens for a reason. And I don't know, that doesn't resonate for me. But I also think that there's nuance here, and there's a baby I don't want to throw out with the bathwater of toxic positivity, which is spinning and making meaning of the events of our lives. At least for me, I became a more resilient version of myself. And I've noticed I've been able to support my patients in taking on more resilience when they frame the challenges they face as in service of their growth. It's not to say there's some force in the sky that's making them learn these lessons, that everything is happening for a reason, but that here they went through this challenge. Can we spin this as any kind of hero's journey? Can we spin this as, well, that really helped shape me in this way that now serves me? And I don't necessarily think it's ascribing meaning to the universe, though I'm open to that take always, but I think it's really just recognizing any shitty circumstance, we can find the growth in it. And that is a resilient mindset to bring to our challenges. And then I think that my big take on mental health is that we think of mental health as psychological. We've been taught to believe it's a genetic chemical imbalance. We think about serotonin. We're focused on mental health from the neck up. And I actually think that's not really where most of the action is happening. And most of what is making us resilient or fragile is happening in the body. It's whether or not we are well slept and well nourished, whether we are inflamed, whether our blood sugar is swinging wildly, the health of our gut. All of this is establishing a baseline in our nervous system. And for many of us in the modern environment, it's a mess. And we're really fragile as a result. And we are operating from a place of already starting the day, feeling doom and gloom. Our nerves are frayed and everything feels hard. And it's not actually psychological, it's physical. And so I really like to work with patients and start them off by finding physiologic balance, because then they are much more resilient in the face of their stressors. Then we've cleared the air and we can really tune into, okay, what's our true mood here? What is our inner compass nudging us to pay attention to? And there's plenty to explore with that. But I first always want to get the physiologic imbalance out of the way, because I think it's making us believe that we have this true blue, serious mental illness, when in fact, it's actually straightforward physical imbalance. It can be addressed. And the reason we feel like we've tried everything and we've never felt better is that we actually haven't very effectively gotten our physical body into balance. We've tried everything but that. And so that's usually where I start.
I finished my master's like a year ago now, and it was in functional medicine. And I felt like through the program, I didn't feel like I was learning that much new information, but I was certainly learning, like the mechanisms in much more depth, and got much more familiar with the literature. And I think the only thing that I felt genuinely surprised by was how much stress negatively impacts our body. Like, you can work out, you can sleep, you can eat well. But if you are constantly in this like chronically stressed out state, it's really hard to come back from that. And that's if you're doing everything else, which, to your point, most people aren't even doing that. So most people are chronically stressed, and then their bodies are also inflamed and stressed in their own way. And even in this like wellness world, 15 years in, we've been doing this work, and I feel like wellness is just another stressor for people, because they're trying to do it perfectly. They're trying to eat perfectly. They're trying to take all the right supplements. They're trying to tweak all the right meditations or whatever. It's like, whatever it is, that is, we have missed the boat, on what like the true sort of path to inner peace and wellness is, if we're stressed on our way to yoga, if we're rushing to, take our supplements, whatever the thing is. But I'd love to hear from you, because you said, stress, we tend to look at it from the neck up. When somebody is stressed, can you talk us through like what is happening both from the neck up, but also kind of total body physiology, because, it impacts your digestion, it impacts everything. So like, what is happening in the body when we're stressed?
Yeah. And I also just want to acknowledge, you're so spot on about wellness. And it really started as a reclamation. Wellness was speaking truth to power. And it was women who were feeling dismissed and gaslit and bullied by their practitioners. And we took matters into our own hands. We learned that food can be medicine and poison. We learned how to take care of ourselves. And we realized it doesn't have to be gatekept behind a degree and credentials, that there's a lot we can do for ourselves. It has over time evolved into a sublimated eating disorder and into an industrial complex. And we are at a point now where we've lost the plot with wellness. And when wellness becomes the foreground and the goal of your life, then we miss the point, because it was always only ever to get our health back into balance so that we can carry out our fulfilling life.
So that we can live life in that healthy body and not obsess over,
That's right. So stress. I think what's so critical to recognize about stress is that this has to do with how your body wisely is triaging. And if we think about the settings under which we evolved, let's say 80 or 90% of the time, things were copacetic. We were grazing, we were chilling, it was safe. And then once in a while, a predator comes around, and then it's a life or death acute stressor. So we're really well set up for that. And it makes a lot of sense for our body to say, whoa, right now, we have to put all of our resources towards survival in this acute life or death stressful moment. So let's shut down all the other systems. Let's not have blood flow going to the digestive tract. Let's not have blood flow and energy going towards repairing tissues that are damaged around the body. Let's just put all of our blood flow towards surviving this moment. So we put it towards dilating our pupils, towards our muscles, towards tensing our shoulders and our jaw, basically making it possible so that we can think quickly and run fast or fight and assess the situation and survive it. And it shuts down all the other systems, which is a really smart triaging of blood flow and energy, as long as the stressors you're up against are rare, discrete, occasional, acute stressors. And as long as then your body goes back into a state of parasympathetic tone in the nervous system, rest, digest, relaxation. And that's where all the other housekeeping happens. That's where we digest our food well and absorb our nutrients. That's where we have healthy arousal. That's where we have healthy mindset. This is where all the other functions can happen, even our body repairing damage, making sure that our knee joint stays healthy. All of this happens in a state of relaxation. That's where repair happens. That's where digestion happens. We call it rest and digest and repair. And so as long as that's 80 or 90% of the time, body works well. But everything is a little flipped in modern life. We're not necessarily facing acute life or death stressors for the most part, thank goodness. But we are spending that 80 or 90% of our time not in a parasympathetic rest, digest, repair tone. We're spending it in a low-grade sympathetic stress response. And that means that our body is still wisely triaging away from rest, away from repair, away from digestion. And then we see the effects of that, the fact that we all have such dysfunctional digestive tracts, the fact that people have low sex drive, people are burned through with all the way that our body has to operate on all cylinders when it's dealing with a stressor. That really steals from future energy. So we're burned out from this, we're exhausted from it. We deplete a lot of our neurochemical components that help us feel well because we're just using it all up to face this stressor that our body doesn't really know the difference between, is it a life or death threat or not? And so here we are, where all of these systems of our body are like the screws are popping out of them because we don't spend enough time in parasympathetic tone. And there's no blame here, right? This is modern environment. It's not individual choices for the most part. This is an inevitable series
what's expected.
Yeah. And so it's very hard for any of us to shift the balance of our lives to get to a place where we're spending more time in parasympathetic tone. And I mean, I live in New York City, and there's a hustle and relentlessness to life. And even if you're trying to cultivate relaxation, there's like a drill sound outside your window. And so there's a lot that's putting our body into a stress response. And it's tough on the overall operating of the body.
And I also feel as though people are not as willing to really dig into their stressors and if they're stressed, because stress is one of those things where you can be the frog in the boiling pot, right? Where you can be continually stressed, more and more stressed. And, people won't notice. We cope, and especially women, and men. Like I see it in my husband too, like where you can just get really good at coping. So then you can take on more stress. And so is part of kind of de-stressing, I would imagine the first thing we have to do is really get honest with what are the things that are stressing us out, because it might not even be the things we're really aware of, like running to yoga. Like you think you're doing something really good for yourself, but then if like it's stressing you out to make it and it's stressing you, like, is it net positive? That's one question. And then within that, it's like understanding just how much, like one of the things that motivates me to deeply understand the things that stress me out, even if it's in a moment, even if it's like somebody gives me a tone and I run with that story and I'm stressed out. It's like, where did I get on that stress train? And how do I make sure I don't next time? Because, and to your point, how much it affects our physiology. I mean, we can be doing all the right things, but Whitney talks about how she wore a blood glucose monitor for, because her son is type 1 diabetic. And so she really wanted to understand her own blood sugar. And so she was wearing it, and she realized that in stressful situations, her glucose just went so high. And it's to your point, like you're using energy in that moment, in case you have to run from the tiger or whatever. But I don't think people realize just how much stress inflicts stress in the body. And so, yeah, so you notice, but then like, how do you get through? How do you start to change your own reactions to things? Because that's really all we have control over.
Yeah. I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for why it's hard for us to really hold up the mirror and recognize how stressed we are. Sometimes it just feels futile. It doesn't feel like, I mean, we'd all love to be less stressed,
right,
but it doesn't even feel like it's under our own control. And so we feel stuck. We feel like we're stuck in jobs where it's too stressful in the job environment. The hours are too long, and yet we need to pay our bills. We feel like we don't want a stressful, trafficky commute, and yet there's no way around it. And so relentlessness of childcare, there's a lot of stressors in our lives where I think we want to give ourselves credit that we've encountered it and we've thought, sure, it would be great to not have this stressor. But then we think, well, like I see no way out. I think that when it comes to, I'm going to yoga class, but running there is stressing me out, but it's ultimately to help de-stress my life and in service of my well-being. I think that there's a couple things happening. And I think that we also have thought through the trade-offs that on one hand, maybe it is still net beneficial to get to yoga, even if it means we're running there and stressed. Sometimes it's not, but I think we have a real normalization of an overscheduled life. And we have a normalization of rushing. And so that's almost like the only way we know how to live. And it's fundamentally a different movie with a different soundtrack to live a life where we're not overscheduled and we're not rushing. So we've only known this soundtrack. And I think that it takes a pretty radical change to say, or what if I actually didn't pack my day with all of these different activities? What if I said no more? What if I did less? And what if I didn't rush to places? Or sometimes moved quickly, but not with the spirit of rush. But we have a lot of things reinforcing that feeling of, if you are a go-getter and a mover and a shaker, then you are rushing and hyper functioning and checking all these boxes and like, look at you go. And I think we still romanticize that. Even if we're pushing back against hustle culture, we do still see ourselves as like, wow, I just hyper functioned and did a lot. So I think we have to really radically say, I want slowness, I want less, I want spaciousness, I want peace. And then we need to choose that over and over and over again if we truly want to create relaxation in our bodies.
And then also recognize I think we've been taught, and you just said this, but that like more is always better. But if we stop to recognize what's happening in our brains when we're doing more, and that maybe the choices we're making and the actions we're taking, they get things done in the moment, but without working on our stress, it's like that cognitive breadth of understanding like the long-term impact of my decisions, or being able to think through things in a kind of more holistic way. Like, I don't think that is valued in this culture, which I can imagine leads to like, I guess the product of this kind of stressed out modern day life is stressed out decisions. And it's like, how do we start to value decisions that come from thoughts and having a moment to really think and put intention behind the things we're doing. So maybe on the checklist, we're doing fewer things. But in the whole, we kind of end up at the same home base. That makes sense.
I think for me, it's been really important to recognize that there's a very insidious factor. And I don't know if this was ever malicious and intentional, but I think here's where we've arrived, which is that dignity in places like the modern American environment is behind a paywall. And I don't think it always used to be that. I think we got a lot of needs met through community, through nature, through spirituality. We're now at a place where that's been stripped away. And the world is now set up to sell us back little shreds of comfort and dopamine and dignity. I think about air travel sometimes, where it's like originally a ticket to the plane bought you a seat that had sufficient legroom and maybe even a meal, and you could put your suitcase there. And then through consultants and all of this over time and
efficiencies,
we've gotten to a place where the base rate is an undignified experience, and it becomes a luxury item to buy back dignity. And so that keeps us locked in to a grind where then we want to work more, earn more so that we can buy back our dignity. And we actually never even really get there. So we're just locked in, and in the process, we've lost any shred of comfort and dignity along the way. So we really need to recognize that our time is the thing that is most precious. And this is a conversation that can only really happen on a sufficient foundation of you have your basic needs met, you have a roof over your head, you have meals. And so now your time becomes the precious thing. And we're caught in a cycle where we're trading our time for buying back all this comfort, when in fact, if we have our time again, we don't need to consume quite so much, because then we have a lot of our needs met just through the spaciousness of having our time.
It's so true. And I think about this with food a lot, which is, it's like this need to make everything efficient. It's like what we're solving for, like what's on the other side of the equation for efficiency. I'm not always sure. Like efficiency, what it tends to be like, it can happen more quickly. But then that doesn't mean better. So like, yeah, you can, eat some processed food more quickly because it's waiting for you in your cupboard. But now all of our lives have been built around the reliance on those efficiencies. So the idea of even being able to make a homemade meal for every meal of the day starts to just feel silly. Just so hard. I mean, I live a very, lucky life where I make sure I'm home for dinner with my kids. But am also, work full time. And so I'm home at 5, but then if we're going to eat at 6, that means I have to sprint through dinner. It's not joyful. It's not a ritual. It's even though, feeding and nourishing my family is something I greatly enjoy. It's not like that. It's like once it's on the plate, it's fun for me. Like getting there is a sprint. And I'm like, where did we get to this place where food was supposed to be cheap and fast? And so in that world, what are we solving for? Because I think every mother has it in her, and many caregivers have it in them, where they'd rather spend their time making a great meal than, at work trying to afford the processed food for a decent meal, It's just like, our values have kind of been flipped on their head, which to your point brings us back full circle to this really stressed out way of living, and like what's within our ability to navigate, to change, to make different, when they're all so interdependent on each other.
These are the questions that philosophically plague me, because there really, to me, isn't an easy answer. On the one hand, like, it seems like we've really lost the plot where we're making everything more efficient, but to what end? Like, are we enjoying our more efficient lives? Are we just working more? But I also can't ignore that in the past, a lot of this happened on the backs of women. Like, women were stuck home and cooking all the day. And I think that I even think about this with feminism and with work. And we've kind of, we have made all these strides, and we've made real progress, and we don't have to feel intellectually stifled. We can carry out our purpose. We can have our big careers. We can make our contributions. And that to me feels really important. There's like this engine that wants to drive. And yet I also feel how it, also makes me certainly not in my divine feminine energy, certainly puts me in this state of mind where I'm irritable and exhausted and not always present in the way I want to be for these precious moments with my daughter, and not sort of in a sense of flow and creation that I think I would be if I wasn't someone who was juggling career. But I don't see an easy answer, and I don't think our world is set up to support what would be ideal, which is that every woman just gets to choose like what really is in flow for you, because we're just not, we don't have state-sponsored childcare, and there's just too much riding on a woman. So now when we are working, when we have a big career, we're doing it at such a juggle and buying back the village that makes it possible. And we can tell we haven't got it quite right, but it's not clear what the path forward is.
It's almost like having things in seasons would be so nice. Like you have a work season, you have like a stay home with your kids season, you have a season that's meant for creativity. And, it's like on our cycles. I mean, I feel that within a month where it's like, there's a week where I just want to stay home and cuddle with my family and make, long dinners. And then there's a week where I feel like I have a lot of force and I want to be in the boardroom and I want to, and then there's weeks where, I don't want to do anything. Like, it's just, you recognize the need for, an environment that matches your biology. But obviously, as you said, like it's so far from where we are that it's hard to even imagine what that could look like.
There's no question to me that a big part of the way we suffer as women is that we are trying to squeeze the round peg of our cycling yin-yang follicular luteal bodies into the square hole of a 24-hour made by and for men work world. And so it doesn't fit our rhythms. I think we have many steps before we get to the point where we can actually work in rhythm with our body's needs. But I actually believe the first step is that we want to be tracking our cycles. And that's something I learned to do in my mid-30s. And I wish I had learned it when I was 11. And
Same.
if you just hit the ground running when you first get your period, if you can understand.
It's like deeply know yourself.
For me, it felt like putting glasses on for the first time. It was like, I was just listening to a song earlier today, And I have this vivid memory of walking down the street in New York City in my 20s, being so poignantly sad to this song and thinking, I should break up with my boyfriend and everything is messed up in my life. And in retrospect, no question, that was probably the day before I got my period. But at the time, I was not seeing through that lens.
Right.
I was just thinking everything is terrible. And it's powerful to know, here's when I'm follicular and I could take down the world. Here's when I'm ovulating and sex feels better. And here's when I'm luteal and I'm more inclined to say no to plans and take a bath and eat a pile of mashed potatoes and be a little bit more compassionate with myself. And certainly to recognize when I feel like I am unlovable and nothing is working in life, that's just the tender rawness of the days before your period. And it's powerful to know that. And I wish I had known that when I was 11. And I want more girls these days to learn that early in their reproductive lives.
To learn that early, and then also through perimenopause too. I mean, to just start to, I think if you've spent your life getting to know yourself and your body so well, and at Sakara, we always talk about sitting in the driver's seat of your health. And like, how do you do that? You know yourself better than any professional, any healer. And you know what tools get you to this place where you feel really good, and you know what you need at any given moment. And maybe you'll deny that need. Maybe you'll have choices around that knowledge. But I think having that knowledge is one of the most powerful things, and like that intimate connection and knowing of yourself. But you can imagine, like, yeah, we're talking about stress and anxiety today, but even just existing as a woman in this very modern world, in and of itself, it's not meant for our cyclicality. So even just being met and honoring that. And I think, you said it earlier, but part of mental health isn't just, it's not just like toxic positivity or getting through any bad situation. But imagine it's also like, hey, yeah, this world wasn't necessarily meant for my cycle. And I'm going to honor that that's really hard sometimes, and let myself be sad about it sometimes, and let myself be mad about it sometimes. And I forget what word you used. Maybe you used metabolize or alchemize those feelings, because we've been taught to not have them or push them aside or not even recognize them as valid. But to let yourself have them is part of that kind of resilience building of mental health.
Yes, both because I think it's never healthy to strong arm and push away something that is alive in us. We want to feel what's there to be felt, but also that's how we crystallize what contribution do we want to make. Altruistic responses to what's hard or what makes us feel sad or what makes us feel outraged. That's a very healthy defense to say, okay, then I at least want to teach my daughter this so that she can improve upon the situation that I found myself in. And I think that it is so important to recognize our worthiness of getting our needs met. I think this is another way that it is hard just to exist as a woman, is all of that conditioning that we get that tells us she who is most selfless, that's who is celebrated. And so if we're neurotypical and wired to promote good relationships, like we'll get that memo and we'll say, okay, got it. I will always put others' needs in front of my own. I will also always self-sacrifice. I will make self-deprecating jokes and never see myself as worthy of getting my needs met, because that seems to be what makes me likable. That's what protects relationships and attachment. And I think that is a piece of this, because as we start to know our bodies and as we start to know our needs and the different phases of our menstrual cycle, we also have to then feel worthy of getting our needs met. Like for me, late in the luteal phase, that's a time when culturally we've branded that as you're bitchy, you're irrational, you're PMSing. And I actually think that we've just stripped off the rose-tinted glasses in the late luteal phase. I think that's actually when we have a decreased tolerance for BS. We see things more clearly as they are. We're a little more raw and irritable about it, but we're seeing things quite clearly. Whereas in the follicular phase, that's when things roll off our shoulders. We're not getting as bent out of shape about things that actually are kind of messed up. We roll with it. We're very docile. And that is a better fit for our world. That's how the world wants us. That's how we want ourselves. But it's the luteal phase where the truth comes out and rears its ugly head. And I think that we also need to feel worthy of demanding change when we say, okay, this actually is an intolerable situation, and I'm worthy of getting this need met for myself.
Yeah. And also, if your need can't be met, it's still just as valuable to know that it wasn't met instead of pretending things are okay. Like even just, I think about this in relationships a lot. My husband and I we're going to have our 10-year wedding anniversary soon, which is wild. But part of the work, at least for me, has been to recognize when sometimes I have a need and I can know I deserve to have that need met, but that it's also impossible for a partner to meet every single need, and that I'm allowed to have grief and be sad, and it doesn't take down the relationship. In some ways, I found like it's just made it better because we're just being so true and so honest. And it's not, obviously, because we're happily married still, it's not things that would fundamentally change our love for each other, but they are real things. And I think even just honoring them, recognizing them has brought significantly less stress to my personal life, because I don't have to pretend like I shouldn't want them or shouldn't have those needs. I feel like a lot for women, it's recognizing just like we deserve to have our needs met. And that doesn't mean they will be, but just knowing that and then letting the feelings metabolizing, as you said, the feelings around that is so much less stressful than pretending it's not okay. Yeah.
Oh, yes. No pretending. And I think I really like the way Dr. Becky puts it of two things can be true. Like this relationship, this aspect of this person is not meeting a need in me, and it's still a worthy and wonderful relationship.
Yeah.
And the idea of like holding those seemingly contradictory truths is such a sign of maturity. The more we can hold multiple contradictory truths. And I think that helps us allow for two things to be true in our relationships, but it also allows us to meet each other with more understanding and nuance and compassion. Like all of the dumpster fire of comment sections and social media is basically people who cannot tolerate two things being true.
Right.
It's like, but what about this? It's like, no, that's
the nuance
also true.
is lost.
It's all lost. And I think that worthiness of getting our needs met is just the beginning. And I like a Marshall B. Rosenberg nonviolent communication approach to getting those needs met, which is like, I offer this opportunity. You could enrich my life if you want to meet this need, but also you're not obligated to. I'm just throwing it out there, and that's ultimately up to you. And I'm not going to use antics or manipulation or indirect ways of trying to obligate you into meeting this need. I just offer it up without obligation.
I love nonviolent communication. It's been one of those books that I'm not sure I've read the whole book, but it's been with me so long that I'm pretty sure via osmosis. And it's one of those books I always have next to me. It's very funny that you just brought it up. Because we're back kind of down in the jungle now. And I brought a suitcase full of books. And that was in there. And I thought, it's so funny it hasn't been down here with me till now, because it's usually the one I always bring. But I love it because I think it makes you recognize where you can hide behind your own language and use language as a tool against someone to try and get what you want, which when you say it out loud, you're like, why would I ever do that? It really doesn't make sense, but it's in our language to not take responsibility for our feelings, to put the onus on the person we're conversing with. And what you were saying a bit ago, what I see happening right now is a lot of people just kind of drawing sharp lines and being like, oh no, I'm not going to let that person in my life anymore. I'm not going to. And it's like, to your point about nuances, it's like, I feel like we're forgetting the nuance, which is why I brought up, you can navigate not having your needs met and still adore the person for what they do bring. It's like, I think we're getting so serious about our standards. To our point about wellness, we always take things too far. It's like, I think it's in the human condition, which is we take things to the end so we can just see what's down there. But where I'm like, well, were there things that you really loved about that person? And can you just honor like your grief that they're not providing those other things? And I don't know, I see a lot of people being like, oh no, they're out of my life. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that? Drawing those hard lines.
Exactly right. And I think that there's certainly a time and place for a hard boundary. And I've had patients over the years where that's our conclusion after many attempts is like, this person needs to be removed from your life. Then much more often than that is that the spirit of boundaries was never actually about cutting ties. The spirit of boundaries is preserving relationships. And that's where I think we miss it. The spirit of a boundary is that you're rooting for the relationship to work, but for it to work and for everyone to be okay, intact, and getting their needs met in this relationship, a boundary needs to be placed. And then again, holding the boundary is up to you. It's not up to the other person. And so you hold it. And I think that that's where we get it wrong. Is
such a good
I'm
point.
setting a boundary. This person is toxic. They're a narcissist and I'm cutting them out of my life. And then we go right back to thinking like I'm so virtuous and they're so bad. And I think we really sometimes are not seeing the spirit behind someone's actions, because we all speak a different language. Each generation speaks a different language. And sometimes the older generations, they're not speaking the languages of the younger generations. And we take that to mean they're incorrigible and toxic and narcissistic and deserve to be cut out of our lives. But still, I think we're responsible for feeling the spirit behind what they're saying, even if they're saying the wrong thing according to the lexicon of modernity. Is it love underneath that? Is it pain underneath that? I think it's still always worth listening for the spirit underneath the words, and to set a boundary in the spirit of protecting, preserving the relationship and making it work for everyone involved going forward.
So beautifully said. Well, thank you for today and for your time. I love our conversations, both here on the podcast and in real life. Thank you for all that you do, and I just adore you. We like to end every podcast asking for some light work, which is just homework, actionable things people can do to kind of bring some of this into their life and bring the light into their life.
Ordinarily, all of my homework is get the phone out of the bedroom and keep your blood sugar stable and, crawl into bed a little earlier. I think today, given everything that we've touched upon, I'll say something different than usual. I think one thing is say no more when it comes to our schedule. Saying no, doing less, protecting spaciousness, and then being prepared to tolerate the fact that can bring up discomfort, because in that space, emotions will bubble up to the surface. You'll just be alone with your thoughts. And can you befriend that? Can you actually roll with what bubbles up and hold that and stay curious about it and actually want that emotion to come up, rather than saying, oh, this was the reason I stay so busy. I didn't want these emotions. So saying no when it comes to our schedule. But then I think when it comes to our relationships, let's have that be a takeaway, that look for the spirit behind what somebody's saying and maintain that the spirit of boundaries is the preservation of relationships. I think the spirit of pretty much everything we should be doing is the preservation of relationships. We want to stay connected. We want to root for love whenever possible.
So beautifully said. Thank you so much, Dr. Vora.
Thank you, Danielle. This is always a delight. I appreciate you so much.